Welcome to the Simply Christian Life. My name is Michael Hunn. I'm the Bishop of the Diocese of the Rio Grande for the Episcopal Church, which encompasses the entire state of New Mexico with the exception of the Navajo Nation and the far west part of Texas. This is Meditation 2 in our series, Here Be Dragons, 3 meditations on the Apophatic Way. What happens when God says no? Many of us still carry an image of the Episcopal Church that exerts real gravitational pull on our imagination. An image of stability, of dignity, of institutional confidence. Our presiding bishop, the Most Reverend Sean Rowe, explains this Episcopalian self-confidence with a single image. On March 26, 1951, Henry Knox Sherrill, presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church and the president of the United States Council of Churches, appeared on the cover of Time magazine. The cover shows a sketch of presiding Bishop Sherrill from his shoulders up. He is vested in choir dress, showing his doctoral academic hood around his neck. And behind him, sort of in the background, there is a large cross and hundreds of people streaming towards the cross. The image was unmistakable. Here we see the newly elected presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, and behind him, all the other Protestant denominations falling into line. Ours was the church to lead the faithful Christians of the United States of America. The Episcopal Church was worth following, and millions would. The Episcopal Church, learned, wise, scholarly, dignified, and of course, with the best vestments, let's be honest. Builder of the National Cathedral, a church whose leaders moved easily among the leaders of nations. A church at the center of American life. We, of course, today want our church to change. We want it to be more diverse, to look like the kingdom of God. We want it to include more people of color. We want it to include people of all walks of life, not just a bunch of people who look like presiding Bishop Sherrill. But other than that, other than improving our diversity, it would be nice to keep the rest of it. The power and the influence. It would be nice if the resolutions of our General Convention would be national news and make waves and set policy. It would be nice if we could influence the powers that be in the world. Our institutions flourishing, our seminaries expanding, every town or neighborhood having a beautiful church, a stone church with stained glass. And leading that church, of course, there must be a seminary-trained priest whose vocation was secure and respected by all. Clergy families living respectable upper-middle-class lives in comfortable rectories with a family health care plan for every priest. And the church pension fund, of course, securing a comfortable retirement for us all. It was possible at one time, very possible, to imagine not just serving Jesus, but getting a solid career and a pension in the bargain, all while being respected everywhere in society. That image may still live in many of us, but we are no longer living in that moment. We are living beyond it. And we see plenty of evidence. When we speak honestly about decline or transition, even as we know that many churches cannot afford a full-time priest, and as the average church has $250,000 of deferred and delayed maintenance they cannot afford to fix, and as the presiding Bishop Sean Rowe reminds us, today a third of dioceses in the United States Episcopal Church are not financially viable as we speak. A third of those dioceses are borderline financially viable, and a third are viable largely because of legacy gifts from the distant past. Yes, there are many churches growing. Many of our Episcopal churches are growing, but they're mostly in urban areas. If we judge ourselves by numerical or financial success, many of us clergy are in for a shock. That's the reality. And if that is so, together, my friends, you and I will be serving a church in a time when the apophatic stripping away is greater than the cataphatic building and growing. From where I sit as a bishop, what we are experiencing now is not simply institutional stress. It's not mere decline. It's not merely demographic change, and it's not just about finances. We are being called to re-examine what it means to be church in a time when the old models simply don't work anymore. The Episcopal Church is living through an apophatic season, a season in which familiar supports are being stripped away, a season in which clarity about our future and our security as a church is withheld, a season in which plans and programs that once worked no longer do. And it's deeply disorienting and troubling because we had plans, good plans, faithful plans. We had plans to revitalize the church, to grow it, to evangelize, to build new churches, to plant churches, to keep our congregations alive and thriving. We prayed for this. We've studied for this. We've worked hard for this. We've researched this. And sometimes, in spite of all of that, God says, no, not this way, not now. This is not going to work. Perhaps we shouldn't be surprised. We know that Jesus himself did not avoid death on the cross. We know his power was made perfect when all was stripped away. But still, we struggle with anything that feels like failure. I expected to pass all the GOEs. That's the exam that seminarians take before they get ordained. I wanted that job. I expected this parish to turn it around and grow. I wanted my ministry to succeed. What does leadership look like when the answer is no? When things don't work out? The apophatic tradition refuses to soften this moment. It says clearly, our plans are not God. Even faithful plans, even prayerful plans, even plans made with integrity and hope, they're not God. And when God says no in our lives, this is not the same thing as God saying we are worthless, though it often feels exactly like that. This is the moment when our vocation as church is being clarified, not romanticized, clarified. When we experience vulnerability, wilderness, temptation, when we cry out, let this cup of failure pass from me, the question becomes, am I really willing to go anywhere and do anything for Jesus? Even when the future I imagined is no longer available, am I willing to follow him? That willingness shifts our attention away from the church we hoped to serve, away from the life we expected to have, away from the results we imagined, and toward what has actually been given to us as a gift. The people right in front of us, the place where we find ourselves, the work that is possible, even if it's not the work we planned. We love the neighbor who is here, not the neighbor we might wish to have. We learn to love and work with the parishioners we do have, not wishing there were a bunch more of them and that they were all wealthier and the more generous to the church. History helps us see why this matters. And here I must be very careful. In the next two examples, notice, please, what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. Mark Twain famously said, "History does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes." Historical echoes are never identical, but they are real. In Germany, in the late 1920s and the early 1930s, people watched uniformed brown shirts take to the streets. Windows were broken, glass shattered. At first, it was shop windows, not synagogues. At first, it was intimidation, not extermination. And many said, "This is troubling, but it's not that bad." The dominant German church did not resist, and it did not even remain silent. It collaborated, and over time, the German church was co-opted by the government. Christian identity, national identity, and political loyalty were all fused together. And when the church blessed the power of this world, it lost the power to say no to the powers of this world. The German church lost the power to say no to people being rounded up off the street. It lost the power to say no to concentration camps. It lost the power to say no to genocide. And in losing the power to say no to violence, it lost moral authority altogether. It lost the capacity to speak God's no to death itself. And with that, the church lost the ability to speak of God's love, of healing, of resurrection. In that apophatic time, some refused to conflate power and success with faithfulness. Some were willing to let respectability and career security be stripped away from them. They were willing to live without reassurance. They refused to confuse success with faithfulness. Among them, of course, was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. As teaching posts disappeared and safety vanished, Bonhoeffer wrote The Cost of Discipleship, not as an abstraction, not as a private spiritual manual, but as an encouragement, reminding disciples that following Jesus is costly, refusing to let obedience to God be replaced by political security. And when Bonhoeffer was silenced by the state, and his bright future in the academy was stripped away, when he was no longer the bright light, the celebrated, promising leader of the church, instead of staying safely in the United States, he returned to Germany at great risk, where he helped found an underground seminary at Finkenwald, a hidden place to form leaders for an underground church, leaders who would not submit the gospel to the powers of the age. Out of that fragile experiment came his second book, Life Together, a vision of Christian community shaped not by triumph, but by scarcity, risk, and mutual dependence. In an apophatic time, if we are willing to sit with the uncertainty, if we are willing to suffer with others, we may lose our lives or the lives we imagined we would have, but we will not lose our faith. But if we sell our faith for security in this world, we are lost. Please note, I'm not calling anyone a Nazi here. I'm saying that when it comes to our being church, we must guard against going along with the culture, any culture at the expense of the gospel. The gospel must be how we navigate culture, politics, morality. We must insist on the gospel and not let the gospel be co-opted and used for other purposes. There's another historical rhyme, and this one is a little different. In Chile, before Pinochet, much of the Roman Catholic Church worked alongside the government in a sort of partnership. The church would preach salvation and prayer. The state would handle politics, security, and order. The church would care for souls. The state would care for bodies. And then, under Pinochet, when the state began torturing people's bodies, disappearing people off the streets, the church was caught off guard. Because after years of having focused only on the spiritual, it didn't have much to say about bodies, because it hadn't said much about bodies for years. And the government, of course, said, "Church, you better stay in your lane." And so the church found itself at first unable to speak as bodies were brutalized. It took about 3 years for the bishops of the Roman Catholic Church in Chile to recover their moral authority, and by then many had suffered and been tortured and died. History does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Today, many clergy in our church hear, "Don't get political in the pulpit now. Don't go from preaching to meddling. Stick to the spiritual stuff, not the news." I come to church to escape what's happening in the world. My faith is my business. You shouldn't challenge what I believe from the pulpit. If this church goes there and you preach like that, we're leaving and we're taking our pledges with us. Notice what is happening here. Faith is being treated as though it were politics, as though speaking about bodies, borders, violence, or justice were a partisan intrusion into some neutral spiritual space. But faith and politics are not the same thing. The gospel is not an ideology. It's not a party platform. It's not a voting bloc. And precisely because of that, the gospel can never be reduced to something private. When faith is pushed into the realm of personal belief alone, then only political voices are left to speak publicly about public things. The church is told, you may speak about prayer. You may speak about interior life. You may speak about private values, but not public policy. And don't think you can speak about what the government is doing. Do not speak about violence. Do not speak about injustice. My friends, that's not neutrality. That is coercion. That said, and here is the real difficulty in my experience, something I struggle with every day. We must try and speak the gospel so that other people can hear it. Our preaching and teaching are useless if they are just an echo chamber for what people want us to say. Our church and the Roman Catholic Church remain the only Christian denominations which are more or less purple, about half Republican and half Democrat. In a polarized political world, how do we speak the gospel truth without compromise? And also speak the gospel truth so that people on both sides of the political spectrum can hear the good news of Jesus. Sometimes the easiest thing is to pop off on social media or from the pulpit, saying just what you think with passion and vigor. Sometimes it's much harder to sit down with a family member or a parishioner on the other side of the aisle and try to speak the truth in love so that we can hear each other. Or is that a cop-out? When must we stand up and shout? This discernment is not easy. It is costly and difficult. And you can feel like you are always letting people down. But it is the work of spiritual leadership. The church must never confine itself to a private interior realm, because Christian faith is always incarnational. In Christ, God took flesh. God lived among us. God was tortured and suffered in the flesh. God died in the flesh for real. And Christ rose from the dead, bodily, incarnate, with the scars to prove it. God cares about bodies, everybody and all bodies. And God cares about God's creation. And so the church must care as well. There's a difference between Jesus being silent before his accusers and Jesus being silent while a woman is stoned right in front of him. One is fidelity, which Jesus did. The other is abandonment, which Jesus never would do. When followers of Jesus fear the stripping away of our privilege and respectability more than we fear God, the church can worship its own self-preservation. And when the church yields its claim to speak moral truth in public about public matters, faith is either co-opted by politics or crushed by the voice of the state. We must be willing to be stripped of our security and our success rather than be silenced and enslaved by a power that is not God. But how can we practice being faithful and not abandoning the gospel of Christ with our thoughts, words, and deeds, with our things done and left undone? Let us keep silence together.